Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we have another Commander's Guild deck tech, our 45th one, getting pretty close to 50 there, and hopefully you're excited for that. I know I am. But the title of this is The Best Board is an Empty One, and what we're doing, if you haven't seen our show before, is we are randomly selecting a card from Scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a Commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. Now, before we get into the actual deck tech itself, I do want to take a second to highlight some of our social media accounts. If you are interested, you can follow us over on Twitter, Reddit. You can always send us an email. And if you're looking to buy any Magic cards, we do have an affiliate link with TCG Player. Any cards you buy from there really helps us out, so we do appreciate all that support. And one last thing to add to this list, which is brand new, is that we do have a Patreon now. So if you are interested in supporting our content directly, you can go here. We have different tiers available for you at various levels, depending on what you may be interested in supporting. I am hoping that with the push to kind of start moving back to more in-person games at some point in the future, I'd like to invest a little bit of money into supplies that allow me to film in-person games rather than just online. So that is where most of the money will be going. So I do appreciate any support that you guys are willing to give. And then, of course, I do have one last, I suppose shout out is probably the best term for it, to give, and that is to the Underground Sea, who recently has started collaborating with our channel. They are doing some short, I suppose deck techs or primers might be the correct word for it, but looking into some of our decks and showing them to their viewers as well. So if you haven't seen the Underground Sea before, they are an all-Italian YouTube channel, so luckily they put in English subtitles for those of us who don't speak Italian, but they have been kind enough to kind of give us some shout outs, make sure that they are supporting our content, and I would like to do the same for them. So if you are interested in some more Magic content, they do plenty of small deck techs, they do a lot of gameplay, things like that. So if you are interested in the content that we do here on our channel, you may also be interested in theirs. So do go check them out. They're a great group of people, and hopefully we'll be able to continue our collaboration in the future. But with all of the shout-outs and the social media things out of the way, let's actually jump into our deck tech. So this week, our random card is a bit weird, and I'll explain a little bit more in just a second. But the random card is going to be Barren Glory, which is a 6-mana enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control no permanents other than Barren Glory and have no cards in hand, you win the game, which is a super unique card and is very difficult to build around. But the interesting part about this deck is that when I started building this deck, I had already decided on a commander when a viewer to the channel actually suggested as a random card the same commander that I was building around. So not only are we now building around Barren Glory as our random card of the week, but we're also going to be using the random card of the week, which was suggested by NoName Senior on YouTube, as our commander, which is Atogatog. So this is a 5-color Atogatog deck that is attempting to win with Barren Glory. So it's going to be very difficult to get there, but I'm really hoping we can do it. I think it would be super cool to pull off. So obviously, since we have Atogatog in there, that does make him the commander of the deck. And Atogatog, 5 colors, white, blue, black, red, green, for an Atog Legend 5/5, and you can sacrifice an Atog, and Atogatog gets +X until end of turn, where X is the sacrificed Atog's power. Now, there aren't that many Atogs in Commander, but we're going to do the best that we can. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at some of our themes in this deck, try to make sure that we are kind of all on the same page when it comes to what our deck is trying to do. And the first major theme that we want to focus on, we've kind of already mentioned it, it's Atogs. So Atogs are a super unique creature type because they all sacrifice something or they deal with somehow getting rid of our own resources. So for example, we have just Atog here. He has 1 and a red for a 1/2 Atog. and you can sacrifice an artifact and give him +2/+2 until end of turn. Most Atogs will sacrifice 2 different types of permanents. Maybe it's artifacts, maybe it's enchantments, maybe it's lands. Some of them will discard a card from your hand, some of them will exile cards from your graveyard. But the general idea behind Atogs is that it's resource denial for ourselves, which normally would not be a good thing. But when we're talking about Barren Glory, which wants to have no cards in hand and no other permanents on the board, this is extremely useful because we can sacrifice our lands, we can discard our hand, we can sacrifice our enchantments, our artifacts, anything we have. And then, of course, we would need ways to get rid of our creatures. Most Atogs can't sacrifice creatures, only Atogatog can do that, but we do have other ways to sacrifice creatures in the deck. So that is why Atogs are going to be a major piece of our game plan for the games going forward. And then our second major theme is going to be enchantments. Because as weird as it is, most enchantments deal with protecting ourselves. And so not only do we want to protect ourselves with our enchantments, we want to try to find ways to have a ton of enchantments that can then be sacrificed to the Atogs. And since Barren Glory itself is an enchantment, it means that we want to have ways to protect our enchantments, to maybe tutor out some enchantments if we need them, and in general just make sure that we are somehow able to win with Barren Glory no matter what happens. So to that end, and as an example, we have Sphere of Safety, which is a protection piece and an enchantment because it is 4 and a white for an enchantment. Creatures can't attack you or a planeswalker you control unless their controller pays X for each of those creatures, where X is the number of enchantments you control. So the more enchantments we have, the harder it gets for our opponents to attack us, which is exactly what we're trying to do. Setting up a win with Barren Glory is going to take a lot of doing. And so we need to be able to protect ourselves while it's happening, and also be able to make use of some of our enchantments that might be a little bit weird, kind of like Barren Glory. And then, finally, our third theme is sacrifice. Since we have so many Atogs in the deck, we need to be able to sacrifice our permanents. We wanted to play into the sacrifice theme a little bit. So, for example, we have Jury, Master of the Review, which is a black and a red for a 1/1 human shaman. And he says, whenever you sacrifice a permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on Jury, Master of the Review. Then, when Jury dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So the more we sacrifice, the bigger Jury gets, and then when Jury dies, we do that damage to any target. It could be creatures, could be planeswalkers, could be players. So if we happen to sacrifice our entire board, maybe except for Jury, and we have Jury being a 15 power creature, we can then sacrifice him and throw that 15 damage at anyone at the table. I'm sure with 15 damage, we can either knock someone out or put someone dangerously close to death. So the sacrifice outlets in this deck and the sacrifice sub-theme for this deck are going to be incredibly important, not just to protect us, but to also do a little bit of damage. And honestly, it's kind of our backup win condition, just in case we can't get there with Barren Glory, even though Barren Glory is definitely our main goal. But those are our themes for the deck. So what I'd like to do now is take a look at some key cards in the deck, some things that are a little bit more specific to the deck, some cards that we really want to have in play if possible. And the first of those is Karavic's Spite. And now this is a super strange card, but weirdly enough, it's incredibly important to this deck. So it is black, black, black for an instant that says sacrifice all permanents and discard your hand, and target player loses 5 life. Now there's a very good chance that losing 5 life is never going to be relevant. It could be. There's maybe a chance we kill someone with this, but very unlikely. However, what we can do is there's a couple of different things we can do here. The first is that if we cast Barren Glory, we can actually cast Karavic's Spite with Barren Glory on the stack, meaning we have to sacrifice all permanents, discard our hand, and then Barren Glory resolves, allowing us to win on our next upkeep. That can be a little bit tricky because that means that all of our opponents get a turn before we win, and it is possible they just knock us out since we just got rid of our hand and all of our permanents. or maybe they just have enchantment removal. But there's also a lot of cards in the deck, and this is again where the enchantment sub-theme comes in, that exile permanents and return them to play when that permanent leaves. So things like Detention Sphere or Oblivion Ring. So we can actually exile our own Barren Glory underneath one of our enchantments, then cast Karavic's Spite at the end of our opponent's turn, sacrifice all our permanents, discard our hand, and by sacrificing the enchantment that exiled Barren Glory, we actually bring Barren Glory back into the battlefield as our only permanent, meaning that we can win with this kind of out of nowhere. Now, it is a very risky card, so that is something to keep in mind, but it does exactly what we want it to do. So it's perfect for our game plan here. Our next key card is going to be Decree of Annihilation, which is very expensive. It's 8 red, so 10 mana total for a sorcery that says remove all artifacts, creatures, lands, graveyards, and hands from the game. So that is exile. They are just gone for good. And it does have cycling for 7 mana, where we could cycle it and destroy all lands, which we're probably not going to want to do. We really don't want to just destroy lands because that doesn't help us win the game in the long run. However, if you notice that it says we're going to exile all artifacts, creatures, lands, graveyards, and hands, it doesn't say anything about enchantments. So if we have Barren Glory in play as the only enchantment we have, that's going to be important because it's got to be the only one left standing, and we cast Decree of Annihilation, we not only get rid of our artifacts, creatures, lands, graveyards, and hands, but our opponents as well. And at that point, the only things left over are enchantments and planeswalkers. So there is a chance our opponents are able to kill us or kill our Barren Glory at that point, but it's going to be much harder for them considering they no longer have cards in hand and they no longer have lands. So that is going to be incredibly useful, and yes, it is 10 mana, which is incredibly expensive, but we do have some ramp in the deck to try to get us there, and again, it really just does what we want and can be a win condition on its own once we have Barren Glory in play. And then, finally, our last key card is Renounce. So, when I started building this deck, I had actually never heard of Renounce before, but looking at it, it's pretty good for what it does, and honestly, it should probably be played in more decks, especially decks that care about sacrifice, that have white in them. So, Renounce is 1 and a white for an instant, that says sacrifice any number of permanents. You gain 2 life for each one sacrificed this way. So we are able to sacrifice everything on our board because it's any permanent except for Barren Glory. And not only is that going to happen at instant speed, so we can do it at the end of an opponent's turn, if we're forced to do this, we can sacrifice everything maybe on our turn because maybe we have a discard outlet that we need to keep around. And we gain a ton of life from this, making it even harder for our opponents to kill us. So this doesn't outright win the game because it doesn't get rid of cards in hand. But if we're down to 1 card in hand or we have a discard outlet, Renounce can be an instant speed, very cheap way to just end the game. So that's why it deserves a place in our key cards. And honestly, after seeing it in action, I think it probably deserves a place in most aristocrat style or sacrifice decks that play white. So those are our key cards. The next piece of this is going to be some cool interactions. We're going to take a look at cards that I think work very well in this deck together, and cards that honestly just help the deck run even just a little bit better. So the first of these interactions is going to be between Atogatog and Enchanted Evening. So Atogatog is 1 green and a white for a 1/2 Atog, and you can sacrifice a land and give Atogatog +1/+1 until end of turn, or you can sacrifice an enchantment and give Atogatog +1/+1 until end of turn. So if we combine that up with Enchanted Evening, which is 3 and then 2 Hybrid Azorius for an enchantment, all permanents are enchantments in addition to their other types. So by having Atogatog and Enchanted Evening on the battlefield at the same time, Enchanted Evening turns everything into an enchantment, and then Atogatog can sacrifice every single permanent on the board except for the Barren Glory, because the only thing it's not going to be able to sacrifice is either itself or the Enchanted Evening. It will get literally everything else. So as long as we have some way to deal with our last permanent or our last couple of permanents, then we are going to be pretty much good to go. It does make it a little bit tricky because we do have to leave one of them, but being able to get rid of most of our permanents is going to be incredibly useful. And honestly, even just being able to sacrifice all our lands and our creatures and everything we have could make Atogatog a 15/15, a 20/20 power creature. And that might just be what we need to end the game, even beyond something like Barren Glory. So that is our first cool interaction in the deck. And our second one is between Sun Titan and Sterling Grove. So Sun Titan, 4 white for a 6/6 giant. He's got vigilance. And whenever Sun Titan enters the battlefield or attacks, you may return target permanent card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So we combine that with a permanent that is 3 mana or less in Sterling Grove, which is green and white for an enchantment. Other enchantments you control have Shroud, so incredibly useful. That means our Barren Glory can't be targeted by our opponents. And you can pay 1 and sacrifice Sterling Grove and search your library for an enchantment card, reveal it, shuffle, and put that card on top. So we are able to sacrifice Sterling Grove at the end of our opponent's turn, get an enchantment, put it on top of our deck. On our turn, we attack with Sun Titan. We return Sterling Grove to the battlefield, protecting our enchantments, and then getting another enchantment when we're done. So we can basically set up our draws as long as we want to be drawing enchantments. So that means we can get Barren Glory, we can get Enchanted Evening, we can even go back and get things like Sphere of Safety, Propaganda, things to protect us. So this is a very good interaction because it not only protects our enchantments by keeping Sterling Grove on the board, it recurs Sterling Grove and then lets us tutor out some more enchantments. So this can be a very powerful pair if we can get the engine rolling. So that is the deck itself. The last couple of pieces that we have to take a look at, the first of which is going to be the price of the deck. And this week our price came out to about $90.43, which is pretty good. Only about $10 short of our budget limit though. And our most expensive card in the deck is actually Idyllic Tutor, which is 2 and a white for a sorcery. Search your library for an enchantment card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. This is almost a $5 card. Now, normally in this deck series, we do a lot of like most expensive cards that are $10 or $7. It's not super common for us to have a $5 card as our most expensive card. But the reason for that is that we have a handful of cards that are between $3 and $5. So we kind of spread out our budget a little bit more, and a lot of it went into things like Idyllic Tutor that allow us to search for specific enchantments or cards that work super well with our enchantments. There are some older cards like Karavic's Spite that tend to be a little bit more on the pricier side. So the general cost of the deck is a bit more spread out this week. But that doesn't mean that if you're looking to upgrade the deck, you couldn't find any more expensive cards to slot into the deck. So we're going to take a look at some out-of-budget upgrades, and this week we actually only have one out-of-budget upgrade, and it's a bit of a weird one. It might not seem super useful right away, but it's actually Dryad of the Elysian Grove. So it's 2 and a green for an enchantment creature, Nymph. It's a 2/4. You may play an additional land on each of your turns, and lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. So this is an incredibly important card for multiple different reasons. And if you have the card laying around, if you have the money to slot it in, I highly recommend it. Because what Dryad of the Elysian Grove does is it allows our 5-color mana base to be perfect. It lets all of our lands tap for every single color, lets us play an additional land on each of our turns, which is great because we want to be ramping. We have a lot of higher costed spells. We want to be able to play those. But the real reason that Dryad gets a pass over some other similar cards is because it's an enchantment creature. Sterling Grove can tutor this out of our library. Idyllic Tutor can get this out of our library. We can find this creature much easier than we can any other permanent type. So not only does it do exactly what we want it to do, but it's easy to find and easy to use. So definitely a card to slot in if you have the ability to do so. But if you don't, obviously a $90 deck is not the worst. So that is our deck tech for the week. I hope you guys did enjoy it. The only last thing we gotta do is jump into a game and actually see how this deck works, because there's no sense in talking about a deck when we can actually just take a look and see how it plays. So this week, we are going to be joined by Shawn playing his Derevi Imperial Tactician deck, Jason playing Azuri Claw of Progress, and Bilal playing Karth the Lion. So Shawn's Derevi deck is a Hate Bear style deck, so he wants to try to lock down his opponents and play a bunch of creatures that kind of prevent people from playing the game normally, and then slowly value out his opponents and win with his commander being able to tap and untap different permanents. Jason's Azuri deck is a +1/+1 counter deck that focuses on having very small creatures to trigger Azuri that then slowly get bigger because of Azuri. So this is the deck I think that I am probably the most afraid of, because massive creatures can definitely be a problem for us if we don't have any protection pieces on board, and we want to sacrifice our permanents, which doesn't really stop creatures from hitting us. So that is the deck that I think I am the most concerned about looking at this pair, or this trio, I suppose. And then finally, we have Bilal playing Karth the Lion, which is a Golgari Planeswalker tribal deck. So he wants to play as many Planeswalkers as he can, because activating their abilities costs an additional loyalty to activate. So he can ultimate them a turn earlier, he can get additional value from plussing them or minusing them. So he really wants to grind out the victory by using some very powerful Planeswalkers. But these are our opponents for the week. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the deck tech. I hope you guys do enjoy the gameplay video as well. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really does help. But with all that out of the way, I say we jump into the game, and I will talk to you guys once it's over. At the start of the game, Shawn goes first, followed by myself, Jason, and then Bilal. On Shawn's first turn, he plays a Plains. I play a Jungle Shrine. Jason plays an Island. Bilal plays a Forest and casts Birds of Paradise. Shawn plays an Island and then casts Selesnya Signet. I play a Swamp and cast Jury, Master of the Review, allowing me to put a +1/+1 counter on him whenever I sacrifice a permanent, and doing damage to any target equal to his power when he dies. Jason plays a Bark Channel Pathway and then casts a Simic Signet. Bilal plays a Swamp and passes. Shawn casts a Rampant Growth, searching his library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. Unfortunately though, Shawn accidentally puts the land into play untapped, allowing him to cast Aethersworn Canonist, forcing each player to only cast one non-artifact spell a turn. On my turn, I play a Forest and pass. Jason also casts Rampant Growth, searching his library and putting a basic land into play tapped, and in response, Bilal casts Roiling Regrowth to sacrifice a Swamp and search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Swamp and casts his commander Karth the Lion, looking at the top 7 cards of his library and putting Tevish Zot Doom of Fools into his hand from among them. Karth now also allows his Planeswalkers to add an extra loyalty ability every time that they're activated. On Shawn's turn, he plays a Plains, and then casts Yisan the Wanderer Bard, which can be activated to put a verse counter on itself and search Shawn's library for a creature with mana value equal to the verse counters on it, putting it directly into play. Then, at the end of turn, I cast Harrow, sacrificing a forest, putting a counter on Jury, and searching my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play untapped. Unfortunately, due to the Aethersworn Canonist, I can't really make use of those untapped lands right now. On my turn, I play a Plains, and then cast Propaganda, forcing my opponents to pay 2 mana to attack me. Jason casts a Skullwinder, choosing me as his opponent so we both get to return a card from our graveyard to our hands. I choose Harrow and Jason chooses Rampant Growth. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Swamp and casts Vivien, Champion of the Wild, allowing him to cast all his creatures at instant speed, and he immediately activates Vivien's +1 ability to give Karth Vigilance and Reach until his next turn. Shawn casts Cultivate, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one to hand and the other to play. He then plays the Plains that he put to hand as his land for turn, and passes. I play a Terramorphic Expanse, sacrificing it to search my library and put a Mountain into play tapped, putting another counter on Jury, and then I pass. Jason recasts Rampant Growth, searching his library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. Then, at the end of turn, Bilal casts Reiki the History of Kamigawa, allowing him to draw a card whenever he casts a legendary spell. When he untaps, he plays a forest, and then casts Nissa Worldwaker, drawing a card with Reiki, but luckily, Shawn counters the Planeswalker with Mana Leak before it can resolve. Shawn plays a Plains, and casts Leonin Arbiter, making it so no player can search their library unless they pay 2 mana. In response, I cast my Harrow, sacrificing a forest to search my library and put 2 basic lands into play untapped, putting another counter on Jury. On my turn, I cast my commander, Atogatog, and then play a mountain and pass. On Jason's turn, he casts his commander, Azuri, Claw of Progress, giving him an experience counter whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under his control, and putting +1/+1 counters on a creature at the start of combat equal to the number of experience counters he has. On Bilal's turn, he activates Vivien's +1 ability to give Karth Vigilance and Reach until his next turn, and at the end of turn, Shawn activates Derevi's ability to put his commander onto the battlefield from the command zone, tapping down Karth when it enters. On Shawn's turn, he casts Grand Arbiter Augustine IV, making his blue and white spells cost 1 less, while making all of his opponent's spells cost 1 more. He then moves to combat and decides to attack Bilal for 2 with Derevi, and me for 2 with Leonin Arbiter, paying 2 mana to attack me through the Propaganda. When they both deal combat damage, Shawn decides to untap both of them with Derevi's ability. Then at the end of turn, Bilal casts an Ashaya Soul of the Wild at flash speed, drawing a card with Reiki. On my turn, I cast Idyllic Tutor for a total of 6 mana thanks to Shawn's Grand Arbiter and Leonin Arbiter, and this lets me search my library for an enchantment and put it into my hand. This lets me put Barren Glory into hand. On Jason's turn, he plays an island, and then casts a Pongify to destroy the Grand Arbiter Augustine, replacing it with a 3/3 green ape token. On Bilal's turn, he plays a forest, and then activates Vivien's +1 ability to give Ashaya Vigilance and Reach until his next turn, and then he moves to combat, deciding to attack Shawn for 11 with Ashaya, and Shawn blocks with his ape token, killing the token. On Shawn's turn, he casts Elvish Mystic, and then moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 2 with Leonin Arbiter, and Jason for 2 with Derevi. When they both deal combat damage, he untaps both of them. Then at the end of turn, Bilal casts Vorinclex Voice of Hunger at flash speed, drawing a card from Reiki. This allows his mana to tap for double, and makes it so that any lands his opponents tap for mana don't untap on their controller's next untap step. On my turn, I play an Exotic Orchard, and then I take one for the team, casting Detention Sphere, exiling Vorinclex until the Detention Sphere leaves play. Jason plays a Temple of Mystery, scrying 1, and then casts Thrumming Bird, which proliferates when it deals combat damage. This also triggers Azuri, giving him an experience counter. Then, moving to combat, he puts a +1/+1 counter on Thrumming Bird with Azuri's ability. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Swamp, and then decides to cast Lolth Spider Queen, drawing a card. But luckily, Shawn counters it with Render Silent. Bilal then activates Vivian's -2 ability to look at the top 3 cards of his library and exile 1, being able to cast it later if it's a creature. On Shawn's turn, he casts a Dranith Magistrate, stopping his opponents from casting spells from anywhere but their hands. In response, Bilal casts the card he exiled, Arasta of the Endless Web, which creates a 1/2 spider token with reach whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery, and he draws a card with Reiki. Shawn then moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 2 with Leonin Arbiter, and untapping it when it deals combat damage. On my turn, my lands don't untap thanks to Vorinclex, and then I play a Tree of Tales before casting Hatching Plans, which lets me draw 3 cards when it's put into a graveyard. Jason casts a Champion of Lamholt, preventing his opponent's creatures from blocking if their power is less than the champion's, and getting a +1/+1 counter whenever another creature enters under his control. This also triggers Azuri, giving him another experience counter, and when he moves to combat, he puts 2 +1/+1 counters on the Champion of Lamholt. He then attacks me for 2 with Thrumming Bird, paying 2 for propaganda and proliferating on the damage, even being nice enough to increase the counters on Vivian and Jury. On Bilal's turn, he plays Cabal Coffers and casts Tevish Zot, Doom of Fools, drawing a card. He then activates Vivian's +1 ability, giving Ashaya Vigilance and Reach until his next turn, and activates Tevish Zot's +2 ability, creating 2 0/1 Thrall tokens. He then moves to combat and attacks Shawn for 16 with Ashaya. Shawn, though, blocks with the Leonin Arbiter, killing the cat. At the end of turn, Shawn activates Yisan to search his library for a 1-mana creature and put it into play. This has him putting Mother of Runes into play, which can tap to give target creature protection from any color for a turn. In Shawn's upkeep, he activates Yisan again, searching his library and bringing out Hushbringer as his 2-mana value creature, shutting off any enter the battlefield or death triggers. He then moves to combat and attacks Jason for 2 with Derevi, untapping Yisan when it deals combat damage. Then, in his second main phase, he activates Yisan again, searching his library for a 3-mana creature to put into play, this time choosing Grazilix Illithid Scholar, which allows him to return his creatures to hand if they're blocked and draw a card if they do combat damage. On my turn, I play a Plains, and I cast Sarkatog, which can exile 2 cards from my graveyard or sacrifice an artifact to get +1/+1 until end of turn. On Jason's turn, he casts Hadana's Climb, which puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature when he moves to combat, transforming if that creature has 3 or more counters on it. He immediately moves to combat, putting 3 counters on Thrumming Bird and 1 on Champion of Lamholt, transforming Hadana's Climb into Winged Temple of Orazka. He then decides to attack Shawn for 6. Before damage, Jason activates the Winged Temple, doubling the power of Thrumming Bird to 12. Thanks to the Champion of Lamholt, it's unblockable, so Shawn takes 12, and Jason then proliferates again, increasing his counters and juries. Bilal plays a Swamp and casts Liliana Vess, drawing a card with Reiki. He then activates Liliana's -2 ability to search his library for a card and put it on top. He also activates Tevishzat's +1 ability to sacrifice a Thrall and draw 2 cards. After that, he activates Vivian's +1 ability to give Ashaya Vigilance and reach until his next turn. He then moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 16 with Ashaya, but Shawn blocks with Hushbringer, activating Mother of Runes to give it protection from green, gaining 1 total life in the exchange. On Shawn's turn, he attacks Jason for 3 with his flyers, gaining 1 life and stacking his 2 untapped triggers onto Yisan, being able to activate the Bard 3 times and search his library to put a 4, 5, and 6 mana creature into play. This results in him getting Baird, Steward of Argive, Willbreaker, and Sun Titan directly into play, but unfortunately he does not get Sun Titan's Enter the Battlefield effect because of his own Hushbringer. In his second main phase, he then casts Lavinia Azorius Renegade, preventing his opponents from casting free spells, and plays a Krosan Verge as his land for turn. On my turn, I cast Rampant Growth, searching my library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. On Jason's turn, he casts Trigon Predator, and then moves to combat, triggering Azuri and putting 4 +1/+1 counters on Champion of Lamholt. He then attacks Shawn for 10 unblockable damage, paying 1 for Baird. He also attacks Bilal for 7 with Thrumming Bird, and Bilal blocks with a Spider token, which unfortunately he couldn't have done because of the Champion of Lamholt. At the end of turn, Bilal casts a Vorinclex Monstrous Raider, allowing him to double the counters he puts on his own permanents and putting half the counters on his opponent's permanents. Then, when Bilal untaps, he activates Liliana's -2 ability to search his library for a card and put it on top. He immediately activates Tevishzat's +1 ability to sacrifice a Thrall and draw 2 cards. This allows him to cast Liliana Dreadhorde General and immediately ultimate her, thanks to Vorinclex, forcing each opponent to sacrifice all but 1 of each permanent type. At this point, he doesn't immediately win the game, but we all know he's going to, so we concede, winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Unfortunately, kind of got locked out by a couple of Shawn's hate bears. Not gonna lie, the Aethersworn Canonist really started to mess with us because at the end of the game I did have Barren Glory and Karavic's Spite in hand and had the ability to play both of them, possibly win the game, but because I couldn't cast 2 spells in 1 turn, I was never able to do that, and I couldn't find anything to exile Barren Glory, so we came super close. I don't think our opponents realized how close we came, but that's okay. It's good to sometimes not be a threat. Jason, unfortunately, getting a little bit stuck on lands, not able to do quite as much. Also getting hurt pretty bad by that Aethersworn Canonist. I do think that overall the Canonist was probably the MVP of the game. It stopped me and Jason from really doing what we wanted to do. And then, unfortunately, because Bilal had his Planeswalkers, and particularly that Vivian, he was able to pretty much double spell when the rest of us couldn't. He was able to play a Planeswalker on his turn, cast a creature on someone else's turn, and I don't know why he had so many just massive, terrifying creatures in his Planeswalker deck, but we kind of decided early on in the game that we were going to let his Vivian live because we didn't think he would have that many creatures, and then he very much proved us wrong. So, lesson learned, I suppose Vivian, even in a Planeswalker deck, is still incredibly powerful. So, lesson learned to not let her live in the future. But I do think the game was fun. I think the deck performed well. We definitely needed a couple of sacrifice outlets at some points, but overall, we came very close to winning. So it was fun. I think the deck could use a couple of tweaks. I do think the Dryad of the Elysian Grove would make it much more streamlined, much easier. So that was our deck for the week and our gameplay video for the week. like I said earlier, I do hope you guys enjoy it. As always, please do like and subscribe to the videos as well. It helps the channel grow. And once again, I do want to give a massive shout out to Underground C for shouting us out in return, and we really do appreciate that. Thank you very much. And with all of that being said, I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.